another episode of Navigating Wellness. Now, there are many people who have given up on following a plant-based diet or vegan diet solely because it's turned into somewhat of a cult-like movement. And it's unfortunate because there are many influencers out there that are taking variations of this plant-based diet and labeling it as a be-all or end-all diet for evolution or spiritual evolution for ultimate health and well-being. And when these individuals try out these diets, they often fail miserably and they end up making their condition far worse. And that is because they're taking a certain variation of this plant-based diet and adopting it, which may not be in alignment with their overall body constitution. And it's giving this entire plant-based way of living in terms of following a certain diet practice a very, very bad rap and turning many people away from it, which is very unfortunate because of the spiritual consequences that this has and the influence that it has on our overall consciousness. But let's break this down. The one issue I have with this whole notion that is being placed around this plant-based diet is that many adopt a sort of virtue signaling approach to this diet, when in fact it should be just a standard way of life. There's no need to form any judgments around it or to try and use it as a way to virtue signal to show that you're better than others, because it's not about that. It's not about that at all. It's about trying to bring yourself to better states of health, to start to become much more consciously aware of what we are consuming. Because the unfortunate part about it is that there may be practices out there by individuals who have their own homestead or sustainable sources of food where they are not subjecting animals to these harsh treatments that often take place in the industrialized world. So many of these people do consume dairy. They do consume honey and other animal byproducts. However, it's done in a much more conscious manner. And in those instances, it's unfair to label everything that is outside of what is considered this vegan protocol as being malicious to the planet, as being a really uncaring and unnurturing approach to someone's dietary practice. And that, I think, is really something that we need to do away with, because it's not about that. It's about becoming much more consciously aware of whatever we're consuming, where it's coming from, what's the process that it's going through, what are the circumstances that the animals are placed in, or for that matter, even vegan foods, to consider what are the synthetic ingredients that are added to these foods that ultimately end up on our table. And that is the main considerations that we need to start taking into account whenever we're adopting dietary practices. It's not about virtue signaling. The second issue I want to tackle is this notion of cult-like movement. Now, you may have seen that there's certain movements that are forming around following a raw vegan diet and labeling everything that is cooked as being detrimental to your health, that is altering natural foods, the natural state of foods. And when someone goes and tries out these diets, they may end up falling miserably sick from going on this diet. And many of them will say, no, it's just the detox protocols. However, the problem here is that it's turned into this cult-like movement, like a one-size-fits-all solution. And that's not the case. And I fell victim to this as well. I also thought that these diets were the panacea, they were the ultimate solution to all our problems. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's a different approach for each individual. And it's about coming to that understanding, because somebody out there may need more cooked foods. Their constitution may be such that they are heavy on the vata side, meaning that they have excess amounts of the air element, and having these raw foods or salads, cold salads, is actually making their predicament so much worse. So a raw vegan diet not necessarily going to work for them. For that individual, following a vegan diet that comprises or constitutes mostly of cooked foods may serve them way better than going on a raw food diet. However, because it forms into the sort of cult-like movement, it ends up turning many people completely away from the entire vegan diet, and they go back into meat eating. not realizing that the meat eating is having a very detrimental effect on their health as well as from a consciousness perspective. I spoke about this in a couple of my older videos, and that's this notion of how I think we are being manipulated in this matrix scenario. And I think a large part of it stems from our consumption of meat from a collective level. Because of the amount of torture and suffering that they put these animals through, it creates this karmic footprint on the very collective. And unfortunately, that needs to be released in some way. And that is how the negative entities that are probably manipulating things in a fourth dimension or in a realm where we can't really perceive them have the justification to push through things like wars or really bad practices on human beings, whether it comes to human trafficking or all these really atrocious things that is happening to humanity. And they have an excuse to do so because we continue our consumption of meat. And the more we can start to become consciously aware of these things, the more we can start to change our behaviors to move down a path of trying to follow a much more consciously aware state of living, where we are much more consciously aware of the foods that we're consuming. How are those foods getting to our table? What is happening behind the scenes when you pick up a product from the grocery store? Understanding what process that food went through to get to the grocery store, and becoming aware of the trauma and all the negative effects that these animals go through. And once we start to become much more consciously aware of it, we can start shifting our practices. And it's an incremental exercise that we all go through. I'm not saying I'm there. I still have to make a lot of changes to my own diet, to my own practices, because there may be things that I'm not yet aware of. However, as we become more aware of it, we can start to make these subtle changes or shifts in our lifestyle to move us onto a path where our behaviors and our actions are done in a much more consciously aware manner. So there's another aspect that often turns many people away from following a plant-based diet, and that is something that I know I've fallen guilty of as well. That is, many of us who follow a plant-based diet can tend to judge others who don't follow this diet very negatively. And that, unfortunately, dissuades a lot of people from ever wanting to follow a plant-based diet, because it may not be the right time and circumstances for that person to adopt a plant-based lifestyle. And what I've learned on this journey, it's about allowing them that time and space and having the compassion to allow them to move into this lifestyle or this dietary practice when it's right for them, and not to try and coerce them or judge them for their dietary practices. Yes, we need to lead by example, but it's not about coercing anyone or placing judgments. In fact, we're probably making things way more worse for ourselves from a karmatic perspective if you end up judging people. So this is more about a video to help us shift our perspective when it comes to the plant-based diet, and to recognize that it's not about forming a cult. It's not about turning people away by virtue signaling or judging people for not following a plant-based diet. It's about coming to those greater states of conscious awareness to start to recognize how the system is playing us into this polarization and trying to perpetuate this pain and suffering that is projected onto the collective by us not collectively coming into a much more harmonious way of living on this earth and with the nature around us. So I hope this video has helped to provide some perspective, and as always, I hope to see you in my next video.